Hey guys, this is RuRoniK95 here, and once again, it's time for a manga review video. Last time I already covered that I reviewed 7 volumes of the Inuyasha manga. Today we're going to be doing a manga review, and that is Inuyasha Volume 7. So this covers off on Volume 7 by far. So let's begin. Scroll 1. Sensing the presences as well. This story thus so far of how this happened back, particularly when Shippo wants to fight off those creature-like kitsune ones as well, particularly what you see. But before Shippo has to go inside the well, particularly of how he could realize that he found the Shikon shard necklace that Inuyasha gave Kagome, which it left it behind as well. Which is the sinking feeling of how if she could feel the presence of the Shikon shard when you would have remembered as well back in present day. When she thought it was there, but it was gone, particularly. When Inuyasha has to fight off this creature who is being possessed by No Raku, of how the recollections of the Onigumo has got to him is particularly of how this goes. Thus, when he has to battle in the vengeance in a bloody way, as how there was a demonic power from the Shikon shard as a possess as well, particularly of how it's in not exactly hiding in plain sight. If they want to know if Kagome was there, but she wasn't there. Meanwhile, back in present day, at a burger joint with Hojo, if she was supposed, if they're in the middle of the date as well, of how she could realize of how they could figure out particularly of what's going on particularly in this chapter. Take notice on this as well. Yeah, and for the only reason is that Kagome could have realized if Inuyasha is either alive or injured in the battle, of how she could realize of how she could not force it. If she could realize that she could fake being sick. But Hojo realized if she was okay, particularly maybe chest pains or a cold or something, maybe if she's in pain. But she has fake being sick, so she could figure out the way back into the well. If the Shikon shard is there, she can feel the sense if it's there until Kagome has finally found it in its own way. Because I think she has to get it back to figure out, particularly until she has finally got the chance to get it. So it leads her back to the feudal era as well. Until she found Shippo, particularly, when she got the Shikon shard necklace thing. And Inuyasha realized the sense of Kagome as well. Scroll 2, Reunion. Other than Kagome has went back to the well, she found the Shikon shard, things just going pretty well. If there's anything happens of how Inuyasha has to fight in the bloody vengeance as how in the battle goes on, particularly considering how if it could realize if there was gaining the strength of this creature as well, how this particularly wanted to realize. Until Inuyasha realized that how did Kagome came back when she has find a way to figure out as how this goes, particularly as how until Inuyasha has to realize that Kagome's in the well, particularly as well with Shippo. When Kagome realized that Inuyasha's in danger, particularly until Inuyasha has to fight off that creature by taking the branch of a tree out of the well and to fight off in the battle. Until Inuyasha realized Kagome came back as a reunion, welcome back sort of thing, as how this goes, particularly. When she could feel the sense of how she came back, when she realized of how she thought he would have been dead or killed or something in its own way as well. As how, considering the fact of how she was worried about Inuyasha, if she could have realized that, how this has got to her, which is almost in a not a good way sort of thing, probably of how she came back, because she can not let him get away with it as well. Meanwhile, from distance, that Naraku realized who is that girl. Basically, would it be the creation of how it reminds him of something? If he thought Kikyo was alive, but it was not possible, that Kikyo has been dead for over 50 years from the very beginning, as how. But it's actually Kagome when she realized that someone was there who's got the Shikon shards as well. When Inuyasha has to fight someone who has got the shards, if he could have realized if it was Naraku as well, but Moroku said it was him particularly, as how he could realize of how he revealed about the birth of Naraku, as how it has got to this. Scroll 3, Naraku. So this finally how they cornered Naraku, of how he could have realized of how it's basically if Naraku knows Lady Kaede as well, if the true recollection memories of how there was like a wounded bandit, the wounded dead body of a bandit. So Inuyasha realized that Naraku is the Onigumo spider demon as well. The wounded bandit that Kikyo was sheltered as well just before Naraku has came to life inside of the cave of Onigumo for over 50 years, which is a partial to Kikyo of how her mystic powers grew weakened as well, which is how it could have till they no longer protect a wounded man against those local demons as well, particularly of how this happened. In case of this, how he could have had the recollection of how this, particularly of how there's a bundles of evil thoughts with the Onigumo has, with including these other demons and monsters of how made Naraku come back to life, as especially on a dead body as well. Probably of how it's the birth of Naraku as well. Yeah. And so this how he's basically of how we realized of how recollection of the memories of Kikyo, what it all has got to Inuyasha, but since her death for 50 years as well. Accordingly, it's particularly with how he realized of how it was praised for Kikyo, particularly of how she has been dead as well. So he's basically wanted to wait for those prayers of how it could tear Kikyo apart, because she didn't go on for living, particularly of how. And Naraku calls Kikyo a stupid woman, so this made Inuyasha pissy, and he wants to vow his revenge against Naraku, particularly in this chapter, what you see. And then he starts the battle with Naraku as well, because that's why. It all has got to them. When Moroku has to fight off against Naraku, but none of it has affected this, which things just don't go pretty well in that as well, accordingly as well. When Inuyasha wants to kill Naraku as well, but there's something of how there was a corrosive of power of evil as well. So that's the reason why. Scroll 4, the mark. When Inuyasha wants to fight off against Naraku as well, particularly of how he could have realized, so Naraku always wants to get away with this, as how like he can get away with everything, particularly of how Naraku has surrendered the mystic Aurora as well, until Inuyasha has almost would have got him. But then Naraku shapeshifts into a spider because he's a shape-shifting demon, particularly, until he disappeared. Because he realized it was the spider on Naraku's back, particularly what you see in this one. Quite frankly, though, yeah, like, how did he do this, particularly of how, probably of how it's almost have got to him, of how it was the birth ever since the burns all over the body of the bandit, of how this has got to them. But Inuyasha realized the spider on the back was Naraku's mark, until basically, whatever you want to pronounce the character's name, Ryokan is still alive. His head was splitting because I bet he was been possessed, particularly he almost could have died, particularly until this wasn't long until Kagome removes the shard, which he is saved, particularly, which is such a intense feeling of relief in this parts as well, of how Inuyasha could have realized of how he could have killed No Raku, and he has the memories about Kikyo particularly, as how basically of how it's been over 50 years of how they realized in its own certain ways. And Kagome almost went to the well, basically, if it works. Particularly how someone felt inspired, basically, as well, this in the spiritual Masma and this Vincity as well. In this, how it's the recollection memories of Kikyo, particularly in this one as well. In its own little certain ways as well. Scroll 5, Young Souls. In this part, in the recollection memory of Kikyo, is now she's basically like how the priestess, as how she's kind to the children as well, especially of how the others were honored to her as well, particularly of how things just gone pretty well in this one parts as well, particularly until there was the scroll, which is basically like the Sutra of Exorcism. Despite though that she may be the shrine priestess as well, particularly of how she could have known something how it killed this guy. Of there was these countless beads as well, particularly as how there was the pierced the others as well. Others thought that she was a demon, particularly of how they could have known of how what those monks realized if Kikyo has been possessed by a demon or if she's a demon in its own way. But she's none of those, particularly of how you see in this, how it's happened. As well, if she was okay, if she could have realized how she was kind to the children. Meanwhile, Miroku has been realized of how there was a tragedy of the princess has passed, of how of her precious soul has been stolen, of how so he's been told, the priest, that he has to acquire to protect the princess' soul at all costs in these parts. So that by this time, of course, Inuyasha and Kagome realize of how where did Miroku go. So basically of how the younger sister of the princess must have been almost got the soul, how to get her back as well, her soul back into the body as well. The scene thing is how he was basically been acquired to get the soul back as well, until something must have arrived of how something completely pandemonium coming by as well, of how it came back to life as well. It might have been those souls as well, and Inuyasha has to fight it off as well. But he has to realize if the soul was safe, if it's pitiful, of how it's not alone in its own certain matters, of how that evening Kikyo looked almost depressed in its way, of how the children couldn't sleep as well. If they could realize if that monk must have up to something in its own exploits, as how this happened as well. When Kikyo realized if she's always there so late at night until she has basically got the souls, of how those girls' souls, particularly of how she disappears as well. Scroll 6, the soul past saving. When Kikyo has these. The girl realizes, told Kikyo, who are those demons? If there's no rest in death, if they realized if Kikyo is dead or not, but if there's over the presence of how this goes, what you see in this chapter, what I can realize of how I sense as well. They realized of how he could not basically until something of how some kind of dragon-like monster has surrounded Kikyo as well. If he could not escape the soul blind as well. of how he could have had the soul, what the monk almost had to do. Swear on this part. What if he could have realized, especially if it's going to kill, he'll realize until it kills the monk as well, particularly of how, what he was plotting against Kikyo, of how this world of time, of how it's belonged to the living as well, of how her soul was like this as well, until the kid named Sayo was watching of what Kikyo was up to in this chapter, of how what's happening as well. But she realized, could figure out of how, but she has apologized to her if has been frightened as well, because she told Sayo to forgive her as a farewell as well, which seems quote unquote disappeared from out of sight. So above all this, Kagome realized of how when she was going up to somewhere, of how she's got to rescue the women's souls. When if they could realize of how there's any to find a Shikon shard at anything, of how they can up to something, of how helping these people as well, if they're indeed about it, of how they're of how hero is no insult at all in its own certain ways, until they realize something from the water, of how they thought it was a person or not. Yeah, because it was unconscious from the water of its own nightmare, as how, because they thought that Kagome looks like a demon, but she wasn't, because she's actually cute, had the form of a woman, because they said it was that priestess. If he could have realized if Kagome is Kikyo, but she wasn't, especially in this part, it might have been the misunderstood and mistaken, and he could said not a word, basically. He said that she summoned these harvest young souls without any number of these stolen girls, of how the demon stealing those souls is Kikyo, if they thought as how this happened, particularly if they wanted to realize what's going on. Scroll 7, Kikyo's shield. At this time, of course, of how what he remembers of how this all has got to Inuyasha is that, especially the journey about how Kagome thought Kikyo has been stealing the souls in its own ways, is how. So, Shippo told Kagome that Inuyasha could have gone demon hunting as well, if it mentions as how when Moroku realized that in the case of the maiden that he has loved a long that he loved a maiden which is long ago before this changed beyond the recognition of how strangers to see the condition, and particularly of how something had happened as well. Above this, by this time as well, when Moroku asks Kagome to realize if they can pursue Inuyasha to follow him as well. Until this wasn't long until something mysterious arrived as well. Particularly of how this stole. When Kagome wants to realize if something's careful all above this. But this how she realized it was the body of Kikyo on the tree. Yes, that's right. It is Kikyo all along, what she has those souls, basically, until she's been asleep, of how, if Kagome realized if it looks like Kikyo, that Kikyo thought that Kagome was up to something, in a more, of how it's her shield, particularly of how this basically, she wanted to know if Inuyasha where is up to, particularly of how things is going quite different as well, particularly in this parts as well. Quite frankly, of how if she was in the way of how this has got to this, until she uses the shield, something that makes the powers to make Kagome cannot move in this part as well. if it all happens particularly as well. And it's how when Inuyasha realized he could fight the souls as well. When Inuyasha, but because Kikyo says that Inuyasha has come to see Kikyo. Scroll 8, the smell of death. And this is how the soul has been realized of how Kagome's been sealed to a tree by the souls as well, since she could not move as well. Other than this, that Kagome says that been paralyzed, but especially of how that Kagome thinks that Kikyo is going to plan to kill Inuyasha if Kikyo hates Inuyasha at all costs in this part. That's pretty crazy as hell. If they're seeking death as how this goes as well. Until Inuyasha sees Kikyo what she's up to this. If he realizes if Kagome is there, especially that Kikyo has the souls of these young women as particularly as well. Yeah, Inuyasha realized that Kikyo must have hated him all along of how that happened. Yeah. This has all been in this for us, every single thought of how this happened since Kagome has met Inuyasha as well. In its own certain ways of how this happened. When Kikyo has the affections for Inuyasha, but Kagome told Inuyasha to run, because you never know what's going to happen next of how this happens. When Inuyasha kissed Kikyo, Kagome was shocked and paralyzed from this, of how she realized, of how she thought that Kikyo was supposed to kill Inuyasha, but it didn't work, because things never gone pretty well as expected. So something came from the ground, because he was being because Kikyo dragged Inuyasha to the ground. Scroll 9, Kagome's voice. When it's like she told Kagome told Inuyasha to run, but something, because Kikyo must have dragged Inuyasha towards from the underneath of the ground. Since basically for over 50 years of how she told Inuyasha that his name is No Raku, that No Raku is the true enemy as well. Particularly of how the vengeance of how it's like it's been dealing with the devil, particularly of how this happens in this chapter, when how it could realize if, and then Kagome calls Kikyo a psycho witch because Kagome tells Kikyo to get her hands off of Inuyasha until something has the effects of how it kills Kikyo in its own certain way of how this goes. Because Kagome almost wanted to save Inuyasha particularly until those dead souls coming out of Kikyo's body as well, especially of how stealing the soul. When Kagome told Inuyasha to wake up, when Inuyasha hears Kagome's voice, of how when he wanted to save Kagome as well, in its own certain way, until something how it happens of how what Kikyo was up to this. Kikyo realized of who is that girl, particularly of how there was nonetheless as well, particularly of how because Kagome realized that she was pissy at Inuyasha because she thought that Inuyasha might have kissed Kikyo in this parts as well. But Kagome was going home until Moroku arrived as well, particularly. Until something arrived when probably in the way of how until Kikyo arrived to see Lady Kaede. Scroll 10, A Gentle Scent. When Kikyo realized that she came to visit Lady Kaede, of how she realized of how something is going on, of how it could remember it as well. The next day, Kagome realized of how she had stopped for a single day when Inuyasha realized that Kagome was up to something, when he did the right thing in front of Kagome as well. Yeah, because this is basically how it sets her off because this how this goes, what you see in that one as well. Pretty harsh, isn't it? Very harsh. By this time, of course, Kikyo realized, though, about the Onigumo corrupt soul, of how something happened to the dead body, of how the birth of No Raku, how it has got to this point, as how it's gotten to the thing as would have been basically until Kikyo disappeared as well. Meanwhile, of course, from all of this as well, Moroku realized, though, that the exploits of how this happens, of how what Inuyasha realized that he's following Kagome particularly as well, but basically things is going pretty well, of how he would have realized of how this could figure out the misunderstanding of how this happened to make a fool of himself, particularly of how Kikyo never stopped thinking as well, which is the serious truth has revealed as well. That's the reason why as well, of how, if it's true, basically, of what has up to this particularly, how there's the real reasonable thing of how the real placement on Kikyo, especially of how he could have stopped figuring out to realize of how it's going to happen as thing. So Kagome has fallen asleep behind Inuyasha, so that's the reason how this happened. So he would never mention, if he could not stop mentioning about Kikyo in this parts. So that's the review on the story on Inuyasha Volume 8, though. The story was pretty great, though, on there. I mean, this realized of how, because there was the hate going on between the hatred for Kikyo and the hatred for Kagome, which it all has got. It's getting really, I know it's a little old news-ish way, but I thought this was a little bit crazy in this chapter of how I could realize. The story was good, the characters are always been in this parts of the manga, though. And also, we got the appearance of No Raku as well in the characters as well. And for overall, the volume on the story was pretty good, though, as well. Come to think of it, as well, because that's the reason. My score for the manga, I'm going to give this one a 10 out of 10 as well. So that's going to be it for my manga review for Inuyasha Volume 8 for today, guys. Manga review for today, you guys. Thank you for watching, but before we go, here's something to say for this one. It looks like I covered 8 volumes of the Inuyasha manga now as well, because that's the reason why I have to review this manga as well. Even though I have been rereading the manga, that's why. Hope subscribe for content. My anime plan, link in the description down below. You share this video on your Twitter and Facebook if you have Twitter and Facebook account, and all social media. Smack the like button if you enjoy this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below on this video if you like as well. And also, be sure to like. If you want to check out my Anime Planet, the link will be in the description down below if you like as well. Come check out my Anime Planet, the link will be in the description down below. And also, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below about Volume 8 of Inuyasha as well. Let me know what are your thoughts on it. And also, be sure to subscribe to my channel, RuRoniK95. Feel free to join my channel, especially if you're new to my channel as a newcomer. Smack the notifications bell button. Be sure to get notified also as well for more latest updates. Keep it otaku for this manga review, because I had to reread the manga, though, because despite, though, I have remembered of how I'm going to read this manga as well, particularly when it comes to reviewing the manga. There is a lot of struggleness, though, but sometimes I can do it as well. But don't worry, it's actually a manga. I can know what's happening in the chapters as well when it comes to reviewing Volume 8 of Inuyasha. And the biggest thing is that it's basically how you can cover something for your manga review video. That's why. So that's why I have to review this manga. That's why. This is RuRoniK95 saying thank you for watching my video, and I'm glad you liked it. Hope you enjoy it. Hope to see you soon for the next video. Hope you have a great day. This is RuRoniK95 signing off, and thank you for watching my video, and I will see you soon for more videos.